Well, hello and welcome back again. This video starts the second part, well, the second video in the Metacognition series, the Introduction to Metacognition. And last we talked about an introduction to metacognition, exactly what it is, and all those tentacles that are associated with, thinking about how you think and how you learn. We went through several different strategies that I have used in the past and that other colleagues have used that have been, pretty successful with lots of students. And so now we're at the part in the series where we will start to kind of talk about one of the main pedagogical strategies that I wanted to share with everyone, which is Grandma's recipe for accountable learning and time management. But before we get, right into that particular strategy, we want to talk a little bit also about the syllabus, our syllabi, and how important the construction of those pieces of documents are. We'll start off still continuing on this idea of our students and how we can better prepare them at the beginning of the semesters, particularly on that first day, getting them ready for the journey that they're going to take in our courses. And then, as I said, get into the syllabus and how important it is for the construction of that, and how we can kind of mesh metacognition into that construction, and also hold our students accountable, right, to going through the process of being immersed in thinking, right, and planning how they're going to entertain material. So this is actually the slide that we left off on, and we were talking about, students and why they may or may not be at the level of thinking that we think that they should be on, right, when they come into to college. So what better way to find out why they think they're not prepared than to simply ask them? So most times when I've asked students, that have coming in usually after that first exam, and we're having a conversation, and I will say, why do you think, you're not where you need to be, right, as far as your study skills and how you actually try to learn information? And of course, there's always going to be, some other reason or someone else as to, to kind of not put the blame, but to kind of say, hey, this is the reason why. It's not because I didn't want to. But the number one thing that students say is that, oh, when I was in high school, I didn't really have to use those skills. But, I have conversed with several high school faculty, middle school faculty, and I just know that that is just not true. That it's often promoted, and they do want them to use those skills, but a lot of times they do not, because they figured out a way that, hey, I don't really have to do it. But when coming to a setting where those skills are not only needed, but they are required, and those skills are not part of the student's learning behavior, it makes it very difficult for them to be successful from the very beginning. So just over the years, after talking with students and talking with faculty, I kind of pulled some of my data together, and there were three big hurdles that most students face when they are transitioning from high school to college, or transitioning from that first freshman year to their sophomore year, where things, collectively get a little more difficult. And, if you had to guess, what do you think the number one thing is, that these students often face right away? So I'll give you a second to think about that. Okay. And one of the biggest hurdles is reading comprehension. I mentioned in the previous video that a lot of times, when students do not perform well on an assessment, especially initially, the first thing that they will say is that, I have never made these type of grades before. I've always been able to do well, and I don't understand. why I did not perform well on this exam. And they mentioned those things that I, said before. I read all the chapters, Dr. Gray. I read them twice. I made 100 flashcards, but it's the comprehension. Students often don't really kind of stretch themselves to really kind of apply, first of all, understand, and then be able to apply what they've read. So when they transition to classrooms like ours that require them to actually be able to apply what they've learned, it's a different atmosphere. It's not really part of their current learning behavior. So if we take the time to really talk with students about what it means to understand your respective disciplines, reading a biology book and the literature that's associated with it is probably going to be a little different, right, than say maybe for math or for psychology or for history. So, I think in our own disciplines, we are kind of like the experts, right, on the material. So I often will sit students down during that hour and a half presentation during that first week of class that I talked about and have them bring their books in, and we'll say, okay, let's look at chapter 2 that is talking about, the general chemistry. Let's talk about how you need to kind of, package this information when you get ready to address it. And so the best way for you to kind of understand what's going on. So that will be different, right, for our respective disciplines, for our respective courses, but it is definitely something that we need to address with students, making sure they understand that your reading now is not just from the first letter or first word on the first page to the last word of the chapter. You're going to have to understand what is going on in between, right? And be able to apply what you're actually reading. The second thing that came to light was the fact that, our students are just really wonderful at memorizing. Like they can memorize just about anything. And memorization, of course, is very important, in the whole cycle of learning. It definitely is very important, but it's not the sole source of learning and retaining. So introducing to students that memorization has a place in the cycle of learning, but it's usually not the first thing that you do, and it's usually not the sole thing. It's not the only way to retain information. Memorization is part of that regurgitative process, being able to repeat, right, things over and over again until you can cement it, but it still doesn't replace actually learning the material. So we'll talk a little bit more about this in the third video in the series, because a lot of times, students will rely so heavily on memorization. And then once they are posed with an assessment that is, say, 100% application, then that is where there will be a breakdown with that student. And of course, the third thing, I'll put both my hands up, I am a full-grown adult and I still have problems managing my time. We all have this ongoing issue, but for our students, especially those that are just starting out, it's very difficult to manage their time. They don't understand how to take all those variables that they have going on and kind of plan and lay them out so that they are cohesive and with their academic variables. And so these three things are usually, really big hurdles for our students, especially when they are transitioning as freshmen. So just kind of piggybacking on the business of reading comprehension, one of the things that I have done in the past, and lots of colleagues across the board, not just at the institution where I was residing, but just kind of all over, is teaching our students how to actually read their textbooks or the material that they have for the course. And I know that may sound kind of crazy, but as I said, sometimes reading specific discipline material, it's not always the same, and so, but one thing that seems to work well with students is, following this whole business of just simply previewing information first, looking to see what the title is. I always tell students, if you look at a title of a chapter and you don't know what the title means, like you don't understand the words that are in the title, let's start right there. Right? If the chapter is about microbial metabolism and you have no idea what metabolism is, let's start there before you start to just start reading with the first word and trying to read through to the last word. You don't even understand, first of all, hey, though, that question, what is it? Right? What is it about? So previewing, looking at the summary and reading that, trying to get an idea, looking at headings and figures. Always tell students, don't just look at the pictures that you like, or don't just look at the charts that you understand. Don't skip those visual supplements. So those types of things, teaching students how to actually read the textbook, not, embarrassing or insulting by saying that they can't read, but it's how to read the textbook, right? Because it could be very different depending on the disciplines that they are actually entertaining. And there are lots of different reading strategies out there. And this is definitely not my expertise or my lane, but I have visited, looked at several of these SQ series strategies, and they're always adding a different number and a letter. But this one, the 5R, is one that I really like because when I explain it to students, they see that it has a lot of parts to it, but they also see where there is a little bit of flexibility in how they actually do it. So previewing, surveying, that's still very important at the beginning. Being able to actually come up with questions, as you're going through the text about what you're reading. And then being able to go back and address those questions and answer them. And if they can't, finding the answers to those questions, right? Being able to read in small pieces. I would have to say that this is probably one of the most important parts of any reading strategy, is for students to understand that, your brain is sort of kind of like a synthesizing machine, and it works very well when you put small pieces in at a time, right? Because it takes them and synthesizes them and puts those pieces together. But, if you're trying to put in one whole piece or a large chunk, it can often kind of, clog up, right? And so bringing in small pieces at a time. Believe it or not, this is a concept that, we all learned in third grade when we first learned how to read, reading small sections at a time, understanding one part before you go to the next. And so by the time you get to the end, you've really kind of learned and understand what you've read. And then these other R's, of course, they can be maneuvered to one before the other one, or, kind of transposing them, but being able to read the information, rewrite it, review it, all those are parts of this strategy. And like I said, there are several out there. So if you find a particular reading strategy that you think is helpful for your students, for the courses that you are teaching, I would very much suggest that you make that available to your students. If nothing more than posting it as an announcement or having it as a freestanding document that they can assess on Canvas. One other little thing that I like to definitely put in my 30-minute introduction with students on that first day is to, first of all, build up that confidence that they can do this, and to letting them know that you already have, a certain amount of goodies when it comes to being able to be successful in the class. You have something to start with. And it's something I like to call the previous knowledge set. Letting students know that, hey, you've gone through junior high, middle school, high school, and maybe even some dual enrollment courses. So you have a pretty good knowledge set already. So, it's important for you to concentrate on those things that you already know a little bit about instead of going into information, concentrating on the things that you don't know. So I've got a couple of activities here, and in person these are fantastic. One is my absolute favorite, which was the most enjoyable part of that initial metacognition conference that I told you I attended, and that one totally comes from Dr. McGuire. I think it's just a genius example. The first one that I'm going to show you is along the same lines, but it's not the same. So this is what we're going to do to demonstrate how previous knowledge set, right, is very important when you're entertaining information that you're not really familiar with or that is complicated, and it's a lot to kind of digest at one time. So here we go. I'm going to show you a passage. And I'm, in theory, I would give you maybe about a minute or so to read it. And then I would ask you to tell me, can you tell me what this is about? Can you give me a summative statement about what you just read? So once I put up this passage, I want you to pause your video, read it, right? And then unpause, and then you'll get your instructions, okay? So here we go. Right? So now is your opportunity to pause. Give yourself about a minute, because that's all I would actually give you in real time. Read this passage, and then I want you to click back on, and I'll give you your instructions. Okay? Pause the video. Okay? And now you're back. Please tell me what this passage is talking about. Okay? Here's that first question of the three, right? What is it? In person, most times, and I'm keeping up with the data, most times I may have one person out of maybe 100 that know what this passage is talking about before they actually see the title of the passage. And so hopefully one person in all of this virtual scheme actually knows what this passage is about. All right. So in real time, I would say, okay, now can someone tell me what this passage is about? Well, of course they can, because now they see that this passage is about laundry. But the kicker here is this: there is nothing that changes about the content of this passage. All those words are still the same. Why is it that when I put the word laundry at the top, that you all of a sudden were able to kind of put these pieces together? Well, that's because you didn't just learn about laundry yesterday. When did you learn about it? Well, it's been a few years, right? So that's the same concept when it comes to reading information that is not as familiar to you as other things, and it's a large amount, and it doesn't seem to kind of be cohesive. Find the parts from the passage that you actually understand, okay, and kind of put those together to see if you can kind of, connect some of those dots, right, between those facts and things that you don't know a whole lot about. This other activity is the one, of course, that I borrowed from Dr. McGuire, and it's in that book, right, Teaching Students How to Learn. And this was the passage that really kind of changed my whole everything about my students and about how I deliver information, and my immediate interest in metacognition. When I first read through this passage, I have to be honest with you, I had no idea. I was like, these are just a lot of unfinished sentences. I have no idea. I could never summarize what this is. I don't know what this is. And then I saw the title, and I said, oh my goodness. The first thing that came to my attention was when it said when I saw the number 3, And three sturdy sisters sought proof, the Nina, the Santa, yeah, that whole thing. And I was like, okay, yeah. All of these, there's several of these that I'm familiar with. And so there are several of them still that I'm not. But because I have a previous knowledge set of Christopher Columbus, I can kind of start putting these things together. So this is one of those also that are very effective with students when you do this type of exercise and then they start practicing the same behavior with the material for your course. I mentioned something a second ago about concentrating on what you know more so than what you don't know. This is a concept that I think needs to be implemented more. I'm all about the positive, concentrating on what you know. It just makes you feel better when you can say you know something about it, right? It may be something very simple and very small, but it makes me feel better to say that, I may not know, all of this other stuff, but I know that this has to do with such and such. That starts a positive conversation. That sets a positive tone. And then taking those things that you for sure know and kind of putting those together to kind of help fill some of those or connect some of those things that you don't know. That is a very positive way to start a conversation. And so I actually use this strategy when students come in for office hours or they come in to go over information that they're struggling with. The first thing I ask is, okay, what do you need help with? I say, I'm going to need you to go to the board and I'm going to need you to tell me everything that you know about concept X. And they start saying, well, I don't know a whole lot about that. That's fine. I want you to put down what you know. And this gets them going, right? It gets them thinking. And a lot of times they actually put on the board more than what they thought they knew. And so I just, I have used this strategy in the past and it has really been effective with students, especially in person, when they come to see you in person about concepts that they are not very clear on. Now, there is also a catch-22 with this previous knowledge set because sometimes students can become very, what I call, for lack of a better word, cocky with their knowledge, thinking that, hey, I know everything there is to know about this subject matter. So there's no need for me really to have to read all this because I know about this. So this whole business comes with a warning because this is where we teach students to make sure that they look at the whole instead of just looking at a part, right? And being so confident about a part to you're not really looking at the whole. And so now the example I'm going to show you, I'll just go ahead and tell you it's a bad example, but you get the point. So for your respective disciplines and your courses, you can definitely come up with a different example. But I use this one, I'll say, okay, guess what this young lady's occupation is? And I will often get, well, she's a model, or maybe she's an athletic trainer, or maybe she, whatever. But most times students do not guess that this person is actually a bodybuilder, like a real life. This is the reference. She is an actual bodybuilder. So without seeing the entire picture, you can really be inaccurate about your answer. And so I use this to tell students that when you are looking and reading in your book, don't skip figures, don't skip the data tables, don't just read the stuff that you want to read about a concept, read all of it to make sure that you really understand what the concept is, right? And so when you are given an assessment, you've taken a quiz or you're taking an exam, when you read that question, and it's asking you something in particular, if you only have a little piece, trust me, there's going to be an answer choice for only knowing a little piece. And then there's going to be the correct answer for being able to understand the entire concept. So when we go through this part of the presentation with students, they get it and they understand it. And I immediately, with their first little small assessment, I will start kind of really digging into them with this particular strategy, making sure that they are reading for the whole and not for the part. Okay, so now we're about to venture into the pedagogical strategy, grandma's recipe, here very shortly. But before we do that, we want to talk about the importance of syllabi. And I can't express this enough, because syllabi are super, super, super important when it comes to student accountability. Also for faculty accountability. I take my syllabi very seriously. All of us, we have a certain part of our syllabi that are mandated by the institution. There's certain things that have to be on everybody's syllabi. Things like ADA compliance. I know during COVID, we had COVID communication, Title IX information, anything that's institutional, that is mandated, that is part of the institutional syllabi template. We get that. But as I said in the previous video, there's a certain amount of free will when it comes to your syllabi. And I embrace that very heavily because I make sure that my syllabi has pretty much everything in it that a student could ask a question about for that course. And I will constantly have students to refer to the syllabus for the particular course. But it's also on my syllabi and using my syllabi as part of the whole metacognition venture, because the strategy that we're going to talk about, a vital part of it is the course syllabus as well as the course calendar. So when I tell students that their syllabus is important, this is one of the exercises that I will use. And I did borrow this from Dr. McGuire again, that beautiful soul, in her collection of work. As I said, it's one of those things that really, really, really got me interested in the whole concept of using metacognition with my students. So we're about to go through an exercise. I'm going to put up a collection of words. And I'm going to give you about 25 seconds to count as many vowels as you possibly can. Okay, are we ready? I want you to count as many vowels as you possibly can in 25 seconds. So if you are looking at this as a recording, I want you to pause the recording as soon as I bring up the words, and in 25 seconds, you log back on, or you click back on, start it back up. Okay, here we go. Your 25 seconds starts now. Okay, you should be back by now. Now I want you to tell me, how many words or phrases do you remember? I'm laughing because I remember myself in this situation at that conference. I was just like, what? I don't remember any of them. And it was really comical because like nobody in the entire audience could remember more than one or two phrases from the presentation. And so it was at that time that we got the opportunity to look at the list again. And this time, I want you to tell me how the words are arranged. Okay, and so we have the same set of words. And so in theory, you would look again for about 25 seconds, and more than likely, you will start to see that, hey, there's a pattern here. dollar bill 1, dice 2, tricycle 3, 4-leaf clover 4. And it's at that point that I would go to the next screen. I'll say, okay, now how many words or phrases do you remember? And obviously, you're going to be able to remember more words and phrases the second time. The question becomes, why? What was the difference between those two attempts? So if we were in person, I would just wait to see what you say. The second attempt is that we knew what our task was and we were assessed on that task. The first attempt, I asked you to count vowels. But what did I assess you on? I asked you how many words or phrases, right? So when I'm talking to students about this, I tell them, hey, we as professors, we are not evil monsters. We're not going to tell you that we're going to test you on chapters 1 and 2, and you read chapters 1 and 2, and we actually assess you on chapter 20 and 25. We're not evil like that. Okay, so knowing what your task is and knowing how it is organized is crucial. And that is where the syllabus comes in, and telling students that, hey, it should not be a surprise to you that you're going to have an exam on this day and it's going to cover this information, right? So there is a lot of value in knowing what you're going to be assessed on and knowing how it's organized. So the syllabus helps with that. So helping students understand the value of their syllabus is important. Okay. And so I can't stress that enough. And this is one of those things where it doesn't matter, what you're teaching. Everybody is required to have a syllabus, and that syllabus is required to have, certain types of information, and telling students what they're going to be entertaining for the semester, when their assessments are going to take place, when they have homework that is due. That is all common information that's on a syllabus. So this eliminates the element of surprise, right? For students, and they get that when we explain it to them. Another thing that I have found very helpful with explaining to students is Bloom's taxonomy. And in education, I think it's now called Webb's depth of knowledge, both of which have great value to them. It's just a play of words and condensing of concepts. But most students nowadays have never even heard of Bloom's taxonomy. And in all honesty, I didn't find out about Bloom's until I was a freshman in college. But I have found in the past with explaining Bloom's, even at a high school level to students, the importance of that is that they understand that there is more than one level of learning. There's more than one level at which you learn. And I remember the first time being, instructed and having that triangle explained to me. It was pretty impressive, and it made me feel good because I knew that I had room to grow. I knew that I had room to increase my intelligence level, that I had room to actually increase my level of learning. And so when we go through and take the time, maybe not on that first day, but at least mentioning Bloom's and giving them some additional supplemental information they can look at, understanding that, hey, just taking in information and spitting it back out is only the beginning. And I always ask students, at which level of this triangle do you think we as college professors expect our students to come into college at? And often they will say, oh, just simply being able to understand, and my response is, we really expect you to be at the level to at least apply, okay, what you learn. Because most times that's what your assessments are based on, is application. And so if you're not at that level of application, well, how do you get there? Right. So this is an opportunity to kind of talk to students about what are some of those things that they need to do to get to that level for your respective courses, and explain to them what each of these levels are of this triangle. I always think is a great exercise to do so that students understand what it is that they need to do, right, to get to the level of being able to apply. And eventually, hopefully, but by the time they leave their 4-year tenure, they can at least get to the point where they can evaluate, if not necessarily create. Explaining blooms to students, as Dr. McGuire, explicitly kind of goes through in that piece of literature, the teaching students how to learn, is the study cycle. And of course, this is borrowed from the Center of Academic Success from LSU, and I love it because when you present this to students, once again, it gives them an actual tool to make a plan. And so this study cycle starts with just simply previewing, doing something before you come to class. I tell you, this is probably one of the hardest things to get students to do, to actually do some work before they come to class. As amazing as we are, we cannot give students every single thing that they need during a 50-minute session, or even an hour and 15-minute session. Taking the time to at least look at the PowerPoints that are going to be discussed for that day, to read the summary for the chapter that's going to be discussed that day. At least there will be one additional interaction with that material, okay, in addition to what you learn in lecture. So previewing before class is very important. You got to be there to be a part of it, right? So attending class, if it's virtual or online, at least reading the material, getting very familiar with it, listening to the pre-recorded lectures, and then of course having some type of review of that information before the time when you really start hardcore studying. So some immediate type of retention and interaction with the material. And then of course there is the regurgitative or repetitive portion, which is the actual studying, going over the information, looking at those flashcards, maybe teaching it to someone else, or having things called out to you, those types of repetitive actions that helps to cement the information for sure. And then being able to assess their learning. Did I really understand that process? Do I really know it enough to actually kind of teach it to somebody else? So this study cycle is a piece of literature that I make sure is available to all of my students, because they actually have, this is a plan, this is a tool, this is something that you can actually start using, right, to kind of, change that learning behavior that you have going on. At the bottom are some tidbits and suggestions for students that may need a little bit of a different avenue when it comes to studying. One of my favorites is the reward yourself. Students love this because it kind of gives them the opportunity to take a break from looking at the information. This works very well with students that don't have a really long attention span when it comes to studying material. So say, for instance, if they are going to read a chapter, and maybe they're going to read for 30 minutes straight, really trying to read, understand one part before they get to the other, and then maybe reward themselves with a 5 or 10-minute break. Maybe they get to play a video game. Maybe they get to check Facebook, whatever it is, to reward themselves, get a break, and then go right back into their specified time of entertaining that information. So there are lots of variance, lots of flexibility when it comes to this study cycle. Now we're about to get into the grandma's recipe. Of all of the strategies that I have presented to students and that they have used, this one is probably the most popular, as it says. Is definitely not the easiest because it is a lot of work, but it is one that has been, proven to give a lot of really good results for students. And I have to say that there are students that have used it in other disciplines outside of biology. Just to name a few, I've had engineering students, I've had English students, history students, math students, a few of them, because math can be a little tricky because it is like that universal language. And so there's a little bit of manipulation that may have to go into it, but the foundations of it seem to be pretty steady for most students, no matter what course they're actually taking. And so it's called Grandma's Recipe for Accountable Learning and Time Management. So first, let's talk about the title. I know it sounds funny for it to be called Grandma's Recipe, but there's a reason for it. I decided to call it Grandma's Recipe because this particular strategy is very unique and individualized for every person that does it. Literally, like no one grandma's recipe is usually the same. Like each student's version is going to be a little different because we all have our own way of thinking about things and learning things. So that's one of the unique things about this strategy, is that it is so flexible in that respect. For accountable learning, we all want our students to be accountable for their own learning. I mean, that's just like our ultimate goal. And to go back to the grandma's recipe, the fact that it's individualized, the example I always use to explain to my students is that, my grandmother, she made the best apple turnovers in the world. Hands down, can't tell me anything different. For you, that might be a lemon icebox pie, or maybe it's chocolate chip cookies, but that is something that is individual to you. That's your own personal opinion. And so this particular strategy is very much that individualized as well. And then time management. There is a part of this strategy that really helps students to account for large amounts of information and planning it out in a way that it is digestible. And so what is involved in this strategy, of course, will be the course syllabus as well as the course calendar. And we'll talk about what the difference is between those two, because a lot of times they are kind of merged together. And they both serve an important purpose in this strategy. Next will be whatever body of material is being used for the course, whether it's a book, maybe it's packets, maybe it's virtual modules, whatever the meat material is for the course. Then there is a blank calendar that is used in this process. And that's because, contrary to popular demand, there is still value in writing things down. And so there is a part of this strategy that involves students actually writing this plan down on actual paper. And then, of course, because we are in such a techie environment, and I am a big techie person, there is an electronic input in portion to this strategy. So with that being said, let's talk about this strategy and how you can actually explain it and present it to students, because what it is a plan. And you'll see here at the bottom that whenever we have a plan, we always feel better versus when we don't have one. Just think about that. Going into something without a plan, you're stressed, you're anxious, you're nervous because you don't have a plan. But if you have a plan, there is a degree of stress and anxiety that is reduced just a little because you do have an actual plan. So when I present this information to students, I have a few little, statements that I will use to kind of motivate them and to kind of trigger them into thinking that, okay, yeah, I'm about to get a plan. I should feel a little better about this situation. So I'll say things like, things always work better when you have a plan. This plan is going to help you feel less stressed, less anxiety. This plan can help you kind of get your learning behavior in shape, right? So that your grades will improve. And I still use this little corny example because most of our students have no idea about the movie Field of Dreams, but it's absolutely one of my absolute favorites. And so I will say, if you plan it, the grades will come. And then I'll tell them, you need to go listen. You need to go watch Field of Dreams, So just real corny, but you could come up with something else. You have your own statements, your own way that you're going to introduce either grandma's recipe or some other metacognitive strategy that's going to in turn hopefully help the students to turn their learning behavior around. So let's go through grandma's recipe step by step. Okay. All right. So here we go. The very first part of this strategy, of course, is going to involve the course syllabus. Now, the syllabus itself, of course, is the housekeeping portion of the course. What the name of the course is, where it's going to be offered, what time, how to contact me as the instructor, how do I prefer that you contact me, right? All of this is relevant because students need to be on time, right? They need to know how to contact me or my TA or supplemental instructors if they need additional assistance. That's what the syllabus portion is for, okay? For them to have a guide to find information if they should need it. The second part of it is the course calendar. Now, the way this calendar is presented may not be the way that you do your course calendar, right? So we all have free will to do it however we like, but we need one. Okay, this is an important part, not just of this strategy, but it's also important for the student so that they can be held accountable, right, for deadlines and for, assignments and assessments. And so this particular example shows what's going to be entertained each day. Most instructors like to do the tentative schedule for the week. Okay, that way you have a little bit of flexibility in case you don't get to something on this day, you can get it caught up on the next day. But either way, having dates in place, having the actual chapter or the packet or the module that the information is coming from, the actual topic, what is it, right? Having dates on there for homework, if that's applicable, for the assessments, whether it be quizzes and exams or a combination of both, so that students know, hey, I've got this coming up, or whatever the case may be, which is going to help them with the third step of this strategy. This is called the calendar day assessment. And so the way this works, the student will look at the course calendar. And this exercise, of course, this strategy is best done at the very beginning, the first day of the lecture of that particular unit or exam, okay? So the student will look and see how many days are there from the first day of instruction for this unit to the actual day of the exam. So for your course, it may be 10 days, it may be 20 days, but for this example, it's 33 days. Okay, there are actually 33 days from the very first day of instruction for exam 1 to the actual exam. What this part of the strategy does is it helps students to understand that you have enough time to get this information together and do well. In this particular example, 33 days. That's a lot of time. For most typical exams, those types of big assessments, there's usually at least a couple of weeks, right, to get the information down. So it's not like you start on a subject matter one day and then 2 days later you have a big exam. So there are enough days usually for you to get the information down. So here we go. Lowering that anxiety a little bit. This is going to be a little different because most students are used to just looking at information a day or two before. So to see 33 days, oh, wow, okay. The next part is where they actually look at how much content am I going to have to entertain in this time frame. So in this particular example, there are 6 chapters that will be entertained within those 33 days. 6 chapters, 33 days. Okay, this still seems very digestible, right? The next step is by far the most difficult part of this strategy for the student because it requires honesty. It requires the student to really think about how they learn. It really requires them to think about their, existing study behavior. It takes a really good look. The student has to really look at themselves, and because everybody's different. I may have to read things a couple of times before I really kind of understand what's going on. Maybe I have got to have things arranged a certain way, or maybe I need to have it done in a visual representation as well as copying and whatever it is. They have to be very honest with themselves. So they'll need to rank those parts or those sections according to difficulty. So if we're talking about chapters, or we're talking about modules, or maybe we're talking about packets, or whatever the case may be, rank them according to difficulty. So here's an example. This student obviously is in a biology course, and there are going to be 6 chapters on this exam. So they look at the chapters, and the first thing most students will say, Dr. Gray, how in the world am I going to rank information that I haven't even read yet? How am I supposed to do that? And so I say, open your book. I want you to look at chapter 1. What is chapter 1 about? Look at the title. Flip through. Look at chapter 2. What's the title? Flip through. And they say, oh my gosh, okay, I get it now. And they start looking at this information. This is an example for a student. The student looked in, and through those chapters, they says, okay, chapter 5, oh my God, carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, nucleic acids. I have no clue. This is going to be very difficult for me. And then they saw chapter 6 and they said, okay, hey, I remember this. I made a cookie in the 9th grade, or a cake, and I put the mitochondria on there. There was a cell membrane. I know the parts of the cell, or at least I know quite a bit. This isn't going to be very difficult. And then they say, well, gosh, there are 3 chapters about chemistry. I'm not very good with chemistry. I know a little bit, but and they start ranking. This does not have to be perfect by any means. Okay, it is a best guess, right? At this point, the beauty of this part of the strategy is that the student will very quickly see that this is going to be what's I call a sliding scale, because as they actually get into this strategy, what they think is very difficult may turn out to be, a lot easier than they thought, because they're actually changing the learning behavior as to how they actually entertain this material. So getting this done is one of the biggest feats of the strategy. The next thing that the student will do is to give what's called an allotment of days for the material. Now, in this example, there were 33 days. For your example, it may be 20 days, it may be 14 days, it may be 10 days. The way that I introduce it to students is that I say, of whatever amount of days that you have from the day of the first day of instruction to the day of the assessment or the exam, you will leave off the last 2 days. And we're going to talk about why that is important in this particular strategy. So I say, leave out the last 2 days and allot the other days according to these levels of difficulty, how many days you think it may take you to kind of submit this information. So in this example, you'll see that the student has given a certain amount of days for the concepts. Okay, even though they're going to rank them and they're going to give allotment of days, the information is entertained in order. So when they look at chapter 2, they're allotting 6 days. When they look at chapter 3, they're allotting 4 days, and on and on and on. The beauty, like I said, of this part of the strategy is where this sliding scale comes into play. So say, for instance, for chapter 2, they allotted 6 days. Well, when they start going through the process of reading and doing the homework and looking at videos, and they say, well, gosh, after 3 days, okay, I got this. I understand this. I really understand this. So then those remaining 3 days can actually be put on chapter 3, which already has 4 days allotted. So as they go through the information, they say, well, gosh, it only took me a couple of days, to get this water chemistry down. So they're going to quickly see that they've got additional time where they can maybe make their own study guide. Maybe they can attend a study session. Maybe they can do some additional practice problems, or maybe they can study with some friends. So this gives flexibility, okay? Not cramming. We've got, some extra time here, to kind of really cement this information. And so this is a continuing trend. I have seen this with lots of students when they come up with their initial allotment of days and things of that nature. So once they come up with the allotment of days, the next part of the exercise is the writing component. Students are instructed to print out a blank calendar, okay, that doesn't necessarily have dates, but at least the days of the week. And they will go through with those allotment of days, and they will, spread it out on this calendar, writing it down. If you receive a calendar from a student, they want you to kind of, give them some input, and it looks like this, give it back to them, because this has no value to it. They have chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, chapter 5. Okay, so what are you going to do on this Tuesday for chapter 4? This is where that accountability piece comes in. And I explain to students that it is so important to have specificity for this part of the strategy. If you put down that you're going to look at chapter 2 on this particular day, then what are you going to look at? Well, I'm going to look at these 3 types of bonds. I'm going to look at the definition of them, what they have in common, how are they different. I'll look at some videos. I'll read the information in the book. I'll do some homework. Be specific about what you're going to do on those particular allotted days. And this is where students also have to be very realistic about how much time they're going to actually be able to give to entertain this information. They're going to have a lot of variables. They're going to be taking more classes than your class, right? They're going to maybe be in the band, or maybe they have to help with an ill parent, or maybe they have a child, whatever the case may be. Okay, so this is going to require a little bit of time to try to be as accurate as possible when it comes to time allotment. And writing these things down, like I said, is very important, because there's still value to writing things down. But because we do have so many variables, there's definitely going to be an electronic input. And that way, students can actually put in more detail and can put in as many events as they need to, so that they can get a more accurate representation of how much time they actually have to spend on that material. And it's also at this point that I introduce to students, I'll say, okay, maybe you're exercising that morning on the treadmill. Maybe while you're exercising, you're listening to the downloaded lectures, you can put in 15, 20 minutes of listening to the information then, or maybe you're going to be carpooling and takes 30 minutes. Well, you can look at that information for 30 minutes, but they have to make those types of decisions. They have to make it. And that's why it's such an individualized strategy, because they themselves have to do this part. Now, what about those last 2 days? Why is it so important to have a couple of days where you're not entertaining that specific information? This is very shocking to our students because they are so used to waiting 2 or 3 days before an exam to actually start studying. This whole concept of not doing anything the day before the exam is frightening to them. So it's here where I explain to students that, hey, your brain has to have time to process all that information. Let it do what it needs to do. And during that time, those last 2 days, do things that you haven't been able to do a lot of the previous, 31 days. Sleep, eat, hang out with your boo, call your mom, whatever. Give your brain time to process that information. Most students say that works very well. Okay, but it's the day of the exam that they get a little antsy. So they say, well, Dr. Gray, I just cannot not look at it. And I totally get that, right? But no hardcore studying. And this has been found to really boost student confidence. It they say that their anxiety level is not as high. They're still, a little stressed out, but it's not as high. It's a good stressing. And they tend to do a little better, most times. The electronic input is also very important, like I said, to make sure that students have a much better accounting of their variables, making sure that they can really kind of plan things in a more realistic manner with the electronic input. These are just one of, oh my gosh, hundreds of comments from students about this particular strategy, but there is a common theme that is found in most of the feedback from students. The first one is that students say that I wish I had this before I got to college. Where was this, right? Where was this my freshman year? So having this tool seems to be pretty beneficial to students. The other thing that is very rewarding, as the instructor, is that students say that after they've implemented this, it becomes part of their behavior. They no longer have to depend on me or any instructor to tell them what are the key points that they need to be looking at. What is it that they should be getting out of the reading? They can now do this for themselves. Another rewarding thing is that students say that these concepts, this particular strategy, as individualized as it may be, they say, hey, I can use this in other courses, right? And tweak it a little bit, but the concept, I can use this. And of course, the overall big deal for students is that they usually see an increase in their grades. And that makes them happy. That makes us happy, right? As instructors, to see our students doing well. In lieu of time, I'm not going to play this video, but this is just to show that, that other colleagues have really kind of taken on to this particular strategy and individualized it for their respective disciplines. And they have, chosen to actually present it to their students and give it as a tool for them to use if they so choose in their respective courses. The last part of this presentation talks about mindset. And so we're going to stop here. And the third part of the metacognition series will talk briefly about mindset and how important that is when it comes to classroom instruction, engagement with students, and it's a twofold. It's mindset of the student as well as mindset of the faculty. So this is where the third video will start. So with that, stay tuned and I will see you shortly.